All right, welcome everybody to the Friday Frontliner interview on A Mighty Blaze. I am Mark Cecil hosting you today with our fantastic guest, Lesley Blume. This week at A Mighty Blaze, we have a special focus on journalism and politics because this is a very, very important time for journalism of all kinds. So we're here celebrating that today with an interview with an amazing journalist about one of the greatest pieces of journalism of all time. So please stick around. This is going to be amazing. Just a few quick reminders before we jump in. So here at A Mighty Blaze, in case you don't yet know what we're about, we are a collective of authors and writers and people in the publishing industry. We're here to support writers in the time of COVID. A lot of people have had their book tours canceled, and we're just here doing the best we can to bring great ideas and great new releases to all of you and helping readers interact with writers. And on that note, if you would like to interact with Lesley and ask her a question, you can do it in the comments section below this video. And I will try to get to as many questions as I can. We're probably going to run about 45 minutes today, so around minute 35 or 40, I'll try to get to some of the questions. So on to this week. We're so excited to have her here, Lesley Blume. She is a Los Angeles-based journalist, author, and biographer. Her work has appeared in Vanity Fair, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Paris Review, among many other publications. Her previous nonfiction book, which I read and enjoyed, more on that in a second, was about Hemingway writing The Sun Also Rises, his seminal work of modernism. It was called Everybody Behaves Badly. That was a New York Times bestseller. Her latest nonfiction work is called Fallout, the Hiroshima cover-up and the reporter who revealed it to the world. It's the story of John Hersey's famous reporting on the aftermath of the Hiroshima bombing, which has been recognized almost by universal consensus to be among the, if not the most important piece of journalism of the entire 20th century. It's already one of the biggest books of the fall. New Yorker reporter Adam Gopnik said of it, this quote, "This extraordinary book can help restore the morale of American journalism at a time when it so badly needs it." So Lesley, welcome to Friday Frontliner. So happy to have you here.
Thank you for having me on, you guys.
Absolutely. All right, so first, can you just hold up the book so people can see the awesome cover?
With pleasure.
Yes.
This is it.
Yes, this is beautiful. Beautiful and haunting, appropriately haunting.
It's a white cover, but it's filled with my blood.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, this is it.
Amazing. All right, so Lesley, just in your own words, I kind of gave a little bit of a thumbnail there, but why don't you just tell our audience what this book is about?
Yeah, sure. So in August of 1945, as everybody knows, the U.S. government and military decimated Hiroshima and Nagasaki with respective atomic bombs, the first bombs ever to be used in the history of warfare. And at first, it seemed that the government was almost ecstatically celebrating its actions, and seemed like it was being forthright about the decimation. But in reality, they were covering up the human aftermath and the radioactive aftermath of those bombings and the true nature of the then experimental weapons that they had just detonated. It would take an entire year for an independent member of a foreign press, in this case, John Hersey of the New Yorker magazine, to get into Hiroshima and report on the ground what the reality of the human toll was and the truth about nuclear weapons. So my book, Fallout, this thing here, documents how Hersey got the story that nobody else could and how he revealed the deadliest cover-up of the 20th century to the world.
Great. And it is, I read it yesterday afternoon, no lie, I read that thing in about 3 hours. It's a brief book and I read pretty fast, but I read it in one sitting. It was just so well done. There wasn't an extra word in there. It was super tight, so well paced. It's just a great read, just kind of on a reader level, beyond it just being an incredibly fascinating story. All right, so I want to just kind of turn back to what drew you to this topic. And as I was thinking about your first book, Everybody Behaves Badly, I was thinking, like, what do these two books have in common? And if I could like take a stab at this, they're both about handsome men at the intersection of like glamour and art and war. And both of them creating a foundational literary text that changed the course of literary history, if not actual history, in the 20th century. So they actually did seem to have a fair amount in common. I mean, I don't know if it's fair to like pigeonhole the work in that way, but I mean, I guess that's just my entry into saying like, how did you come to this work? Why was it appealing to you?
Yeah, I'm such a cliche of myself. I keep going back to the same well over and over again.
Well, there aren't many more works that fit that description. So you might have done both of them.
Well, I mean, look, if I had had my way, I really wouldn't have written my next nonfiction book, about the evolution of a book. But it shook out that way. And, I came at it from, a very different, a different angle. How do I want to say this? To be honest, I knew that I wanted to do a huge historical newsroom narrative. And there were academic and personal motivations for that. I mean, academically, I've been documenting war reporting for many years. Even my master's thesis was about the 1991 Gulf conflict, and patriotism, and how patriotism waxes and wanes in war reporting, since World War II. So this builds on that background, but honestly, I had a personal motivation for doing it also, and I've just been totally disgusted over the last 4.5, 5 years by the attacks on our unprecedented assault on our free press, and the designation by our president of journalists as quote unquote enemies of the people. And so it just seemed enormously important to me to find a historical narrative that drove home to Americans the extreme importance of our independent press. And believe me, we don't want to be in a situation where it's, you don't know what you've got until it's gone with the free press, because it ain't coming back once it's gone. And so when I did find Hersey's narrative, while looking mostly through World War II newsroom narratives, it was the purest example of how unbelievably important investigative journalism is in holding the powerful to account and really promoting the common good.
Absolutely. As somebody who worked for Reuters News for many years, I feel the exact same way. And we were on with Seth Abramson earlier this week on A Mighty Blaze, and he is feeling some of those same pressures, and it's just astonishing to me. I know even what I'm saying now could be politicized in a way, but it's just the truth. And I know you feel this way too, that like as a journalist, the truth is like all you have. And so the idea that like you are not telling the truth or you're fake news, it couldn't be more of a lie that journalists
more insulting. Also.
Right.
I mean, it's like I've spent my whole adult life in newsrooms or in proximity to newsrooms. I've worked for people, and my newsroom experience was shaped by Ted Koppel, who I worked with at Nightline, Walter Cronkite, which was my first job. I mean, so one of my first jobs, for Ted was as a researcher for him, and you're giving him all of the information for his nightly broadcast. And we had a saying in our research group that error is terror. Like, you do not make mistakes. The consequences are just too exceptional. And this is a genre of a profession where truth in the best circles, I'm not talking like a Fox News newsroom, for God's sake, but at its best, it is pure pursuit of truth. And anything, if you make a mistake or you report mistruth accidentally, it's anathema. So it really, again, it's like hearing my former colleagues, my current colleagues described as enemies of the people. It's like being skinned alive.
So well said, so well said. And look, I don't want to make this about you and I getting on a soapbox about media, but I am going to take a moment at the end. You end your book in this beautiful way with a kind of exhortation to journalists everywhere. And we'll return to kind of the state of journalism today at the very end of the call, at the very end of the talk. But let's just keep going with your book here for a second. So let's talk about Hersey himself. Yeah. Really interesting guy, okay? He was a war reporter. He comes back to New York. He wins a Pulitzer Prize by the time he's 30. 2 years later, by 1946, he's published Hiroshima. By the age of 32, he has won a Pulitzer Prize and created what would become the most famous piece of journalism in the 20th century. I didn't know all that about it. I sort of vaguely knew that, but I didn't know how much and how much he'd achieved and at what a young age. So anyway, you looked at Hemingway at around the same age, and I'm just kind of curious, what do you think about Hersey the man? And if you feel like it's productive, maybe compare him to this young war correspondent in Paris, 20 years before Ernest Hemingway. How are these two writers different?
Well, I mean, look, Hersey, as you say, he was, I mean, if he wasn't such a total mensch, you would hate him because he was just, so completely accomplished. by 1945, he, as you said, he was, Pulitzer Prize winner. He was a celebrated novelist. His works were made immediately into movies, into Broadway plays. He was invited to the White House. He was also a commended war hero. He had evacuated wounded Marines while covering a battle between the Japanese and Americans in the Solomon Islands. He was married to a glamorous Southern heiress. They lived on Park Avenue. They had a beautiful family. Interestingly, I think Hersey, he didn't really give a damn about a lot of it and was kind of looking to shed it. And he would do that after Hiroshima came out. His article, Hiroshima, came out and made him into a truly global celebrity. He disappeared. He wouldn't promote his own work after that. He adopted a lifelong policy that the work should speak for itself. And so he was just, the humility was total, as opposed to our pal Ernest Hemingway, who, really went completely in the opposite direction. Obviously enormously gifted, basically invented modern literature, at least in the way that it's consumed by the masses. But it took the opportunity, of making his seminal work, The Sun Also Rises, into a platform for this mega persona, that just, this enormously, instantly recognizable, highly lucrative masculine persona. And, he reveled in global celebrity. So they were both enormously accomplished, enormously talented, but really couldn't have been more diametrically opposite in their worldviews and approach to existence, I guess.
Oh, completely. I was fascinated. He was an enigmatic, menschy guy, as you say, and maybe kind of towards the end of the interview, I want to talk about kind of what happened to him after, because it's sort of interesting as well. But anyway, so another key factor in the breaking of this story is the New Yorker. And the New Yorker was something that is not, at that time, 1946, was not the literary institution that it is today. So could you describe what the New Yorker was? It's going to seem very strange to people to kind of hear this. It's a totally different magazine than it is today in many ways, but it was sort of on the verge and it wanted to be something else. And indeed, this may be the pivotal moment where it became something else. So talk to me about that side of the publication.
Well, I love that it was the New Yorker that broke this story. I mean, as a writer, who's pursuing, the best possible narrative, it was almost absurd. So the New Yorker had been founded in 1925 as a niche humor magazine that was dedicated to covering, sophisticated city life. And, its founder, Harold Ross, who is my favorite character in this entire book. I'm so sad I'm not spending every day with him anymore. Harold Ross, he would panic when circulation got over a certain number. He would say, oh my God, 300,000 people are reading our magazine. We must be doing something wrong. Quick, to do something disgusting. So, they, that's what it was. It was all about, humor and exclusive publication. World War II comes. The second that the Pearl Harbor is attacked, Harold Ross, he's a news guy also, and his deputy editor, William Shawn, they both cut their teeth in newsrooms before they did the New Yorker, and they immediately put the New Yorker on a wartime footing. And so the New Yorker, like all the other mega publications, they sent correspondents around the world, and they had some magnificent war reporting, but they were always the little guy, and they had a chip on their shoulder about being the little guy. And it was, it even came down to like the most basic logistics. Like, they couldn't get a higher paper quota because they were considered too, quote unquote, inessential. So then, fast forward, a year after the war's end, and all of a sudden the New Yorker magazine, not the New York Times, not AP, not any of the big boys, the New Yorker is the one that breaks Hersey's story, which is a mega blockbuster. And the irony that it would really be the publication that showed not just Americans, but, a global readership, what it truly meant to live in the atomic age. It was just extraordinary, an extraordinary irony.
It is. And I'm just wondering, I'm putting you on the spot here, but like, could you look around at the media landscape today and say, like, who occupies the place in the media landscape now that the New Yorker occupied then, like before the story, just to kind of like help people, to clarify to people, like this kind of underdog but upstart kind of status?
I don't know that we have a comparable.
Yeah.
I mean, let's think through. I mean, who does? I mean, I feel like the New Yorker still occupies that. I mean, although they continually have broken a lot of the major seminal, like the foundation shaking journalistic stories over the last few decades. So, for instance, like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which founded it has been credited with starting the environmental movement. Even Ronan Farrow's reporting on Me Too.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's New Yorker, but again, who saw that coming from the New Yorker? So I feel like when something major comes like that from the magazine, even though it's still been playing in that field, waxing and waning, since 1945, there's still an element of surprise that it's the New Yorker, and again, not the New York Times.
Yeah, I love that phrase, element of surprise. I think that does kind of, you just never know what's coming next with the New Yorker. It's terrific. One other thing about the New Yorker that I thought was so great about the book is that, so William Shawn, the deputy editor, he had this way of sending reporters to areas on merely a hunch. Just that, like, I think there's going to be a story there, so why don't you go to the middle of Africa or wherever it is? And so can you just tell me about like that hunch reporting?
Yeah, with pleasure. So William Shawn, another one of my favorites. Love these gentlemen. So they called him at the magazine the Hunch Man, and so he would dispatch his reporters to different parts of the globe, and he would just say, there's a story here, we don't know exactly what it's going to be, we don't know what the angle is going to be, but you're going to get it. And he was right. And so he sent Janet Flanner, for instance, to Cologne in Germany, and she was there with a junket of, not a junket of reporters, but a group of reporters. And she had sort of a predecessor report, 3-part report came out in 1945 about the devastation of Cologne from the point of view of the Germans. And he sent, then Harold Ross sent, who's William Shawn's partner, editor, sent her a note afterwards. And she had gone on the hunch, and he said, your report shows what every reporter should know, and that is that how easy it is to scoop the world. And even if a ton of other reporters are there and have the same opportunities, it's all how you look at it, how you come at it, and how you write about it afterwards. And I just have really, that quote just encapsulated my book for me, how easy it is to scoop the world, and how often the biggest scoops are in plain sight. And again, how just if you have a hunch that something, if you have a sort of a refined newsroom sensibility and a deep well of experience, if you have a hunch that there's a story, there's probably a story.
And that's one of the things that's most interesting. We're going to get into the reporting of Hiroshima now by John Hersey in this part of the discussion, but it's one of the most interesting parts of the book was that it was hiding in plain sight. He wasn't like the only reporter there. It's not like he got into Japan, first American reporter to get in a year. Like there were people there the whole time. There were people reporting on it. It's just the angle that they took on it, the lens they put it through, the way they tried to position it, the fact that they were like looking for a news scoop. They thought it was old news. But in fact, just like the lens with which John looked at it is what made all the difference. So we're going to get to that in a minute, but just like tell me now, so just can you just like paint the scene for me a little bit? So it's 1946, the war is over. America has a kind of a very justified sense of feeling like we won, and they have a sense of moral satisfaction is one way maybe to phrase it. I think you had a stat in the book like 85% of Americans approved the bombing or something like that. And the way that it's being described is in this kind of like grand biblical ways, or it's no different than, other mass bombings of mass metropolitan areas and so on and so forth. But just tell me about like that climate that he's in, and like you describe obviously in the cover of on the title of the book that it's a cover-up. Like in what sense is it a cover-up?
Well, look, first of all, after so to go back to your earlier point that Hersey wasn't the only reporter who went after the story. Look, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were seen as huge scoops for the first reporters who could get on and tell the world what was happening under the mushroom clouds. So there were 2 reporters that got into Hiroshima very early in the immediate days and weeks after the bombing. One of them was Japan-based. The other one came in with occupation troops, and they got out some initial alarming reports. reports about, there was a really sinister, they didn't understand it at all, but there was a sinister, what they called disease X, that was ravaging blast survivors. And, it was the first hint that the world was getting that these, about the true radioactive after effects of the bombs, and that these were not conventional mega bombs, that these were bombs that continued to kill long after detonation. Another reporter got into Nagasaki and almost got a report out saying, exactly the same thing. But after that, these reports, they stopped coming out of Japan. And, that was the fact that there were no reports after these initial alarming dispatches was what clued Hersey and William Shawn into the fact that they needed to get in on the ground and find out why there was so little reporting. And another thing that made this so suspicious to them was the fact that there, as you say, there was a huge occupation press corps. There were tons of foreign reporters there. They came in with all of the Allied troops in late August and early September. There were hundreds of foreign reporters in Japan to cover the September 2nd surrender ceremony. So, the reporter, and they all maintained bureaus or correspondence. All of the major publications and news services maintained correspondence and bureaus there in Tokyo since day one. So the fact of the matter is that the U.S. government restricted the atomic cities. Reporters were not allowed to travel to those cities and report from there. Any reporting that was that came out of there was censored or quote unquote lost, and the reporters could be punished. Their credentials could be revoked. They could be expelled from the country. Their editors were given what for back in the States, by occupation officials. The Japanese press, they were put under a press code by MacArthur's occupation corps right away in September, and they weren't even allowed to mention Hiroshima in poetry, much less the press report about radioactive poisoning. So the suppression was total, and it was, considering, how chaotic it was, in the earliest days of the occupation, the MacArthur operation, they got it together fast. They really organized very quickly to control the press, and they were absolutely effective to the most remarkable degree. And as one what they called PRO, a press relations officer, told a group of foreign journalists, the army controls the food here. If you want, so like let's not forget who's in command. If you wanted food, if you wanted gasoline, if you wanted access to any part of the country, you had to play ball, and that included that involved not reporting on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
And so why did Hersey and the New Yorker think that they could do it?
Well, I mean, my theory really is that, look, Hersey was a perfect reporter to get the story when nobody else could, in a way, because, the reporters that I was referring to in the first reporters to get in on the ground, and to get the stories, they've been butting heads with MacArthur's forces all the way through the war. They were veteran war correspondents. They hated being censored. They thought that the PROs, the public relations officers, were morons, and let them know that. So these were combative guys. But Hersey, on the other hand, he's like a team player with the military. And, throughout the war, he has written glowing profiles of different members of the military, including John F. Kennedy. Hersey wrote the story that first made Kennedy famous, documenting his own ordeal and triumph in the Solomon Islands. Also, Hersey had written rather helpfully a very laudatory biography of General MacArthur. And Hersey, later on was ashamed of this biography. He wished it could be taken out of print. He said it was, way too adulatory. But, when you're making a bid to get into occupied Japan, it's not going to hurt that you've written this intensely flattering portrait of the supreme commander of the Allied forces, who is officially, essentially the new emperor of Japan, right? So he's able to get in. He gets access to Japan because he's seen as a relatively innocuous force. He's not somebody who's going to, kick over the apple cart, or reveal nuclear secrets or embarrass the country in any way. Well, guess what? The officials who did give him access were probably regretting their choice pretty quickly.
Yeah, well, it is pretty interesting. So he's there for like 3 weeks. He reports the story. He comes back. He writes it up. And then what's interesting is that, and this was like a moment of great drama in your book, and I don't want to spoil this because it's very well written. It's an interesting part of the book, but about how they then had to go through censorship anyway. So it's not like this was like surprise. I mean, they gave it to the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Army said, okay. What was that about?
Yeah, well, it was a surprise and not a pleasant one for the New Yorker team because, official censorship, wartime censorship had ended in September of 1945. Hersey went in on the ground in May of 1946, and he and his team were working on the story in the summer of 1946. The idea was that they were initially going to, release this story to mark the first anniversary on August 6th. So there's also, it's worth noting also that, just because wartime censorship was over, it didn't mean that anything that people were writing, about atomic matters, especially regarding nuclear weaponry, wasn't being monitored. A quiet letter went from the War Department in the fall of 1945 to editors across the country saying, if you're writing anything, sensitive about nuclear matters, especially, our nuclear arsenal and the bomb, we request that you submit it to us for vetting, lest you undercut national security. But still, Hersey and his team, they very specifically said, Hersey's going to go in, he's going to report on the ground, he's going to bring his reporting back to the States to write the story so he can evade MacArthur's censors or any interference on that level. And they could have gotten away with just running it without sending it in for the War Department, despite the quiet request from the War Department. Yet, while they're actually editing the story, something terrible happens. And that, for them, President Truman signs the Atomic Energy Act. And one of the things that it states, there's a provision that says, it's a restricted data provision. And it says, basically it stipulates that if you write something that can be considered to be compromising of national security about atomic matters, there are extremely stiff penalties. And it could even, it could be seen as treasonous, which, that's jail time, that's possible death. I mean, that would be really difficult to prove and to get those punishments, but still it would have been catastrophic for the New Yorker if those accusations had been levied against Hersey and the magazine. So they do end up, and this has not been reported before Fallout. I mean, I found the documentation about the fact that it was submitted for War Department vetting, and not just to the War Department, but to the former head of the Manhattan Project, Leslie Groves, at the War Department himself for vetting. I will say that when I was in the archive and I found, in the New Yorker's archive, and I found evidence of this submission to Leslie Groves, it was a misfiled document in a censorship file. I think it was like for 1943, and I was just dotting I's and crossing T's when I found the cover letter accompanying the submission. How
did that feel?
I screamed something really unladylike in the middle of the archive, and it's a miracle that the archivists didn't kick me out. They were pretty nice about it, considering, but I mean, it was a pretty shocking revelation. And then my research team and I found on the other end in Groves's papers and records confirmation of the submission.
Wow. I mean, anyway, that is an amazing and kind of high drama portion of your narrative is when they have to submit it to the Army for approval. But I want to go on actually to like some of the best reporting, or some of the reporting at least that I enjoyed the most in the book, things I didn't know before, concern the aftermath of the publication. Things like how Einstein himself requested 1,000 copies to distribute to scientists. And there is like an absolutely fascinating scene that you paint. It's just a little thumbnail sketch, but about these Japanese soldiers in Grand Central Station who all buy a copy and then sit there and read it in silence. I mean, I love these.
You just gave me a chill from my own book. You just gave me a chill. We're counting that part of my own book.
Oh, it's so good. It's so good. It's just everything. And it was like, and that's sort of like why this book is here, because these are things that you would never know. And this is your reporting, and it contextualizes the whole thing and the impact that it had. But I just kind of want to give you a moment. I mean, anything else in the research that really struck you, that kept you up at night? I know you've kind of described yourself in other interviews as like you get an animal research mode. I think that's the expression.
Oh yeah, total.
And like, and you just get obsessive about your research, and you said you haven't slept in years. Anyway, but I just, and I'm sure some of that is the animal research mode thing, but just tell me about other little moments like that you really enjoyed in the reporting.
Yeah, I mean, well, look, this was, from a research point of view, like the great joy of my life. I can't believe I'm not doing it anymore. I'm so bummed to be out of that phase. You know, when I was doing the Hemingway book, I mean, getting any new information about Hemingway it was like scratching water out of rocks. Good luck, right? But it was deluge, and so much of it was so dramatic the way some of the research kept coming to me, because a lot of it was through misfiled or recovered documents. And so, you know, another thing that was pretty amazing was finding overlooked or ignored documentation in the New Yorker archive about, you know, the whole Soviet aspect of this narrative. You know, so for instance, I found out, or my entree into the Soviet narrative, just for, you know, for your listeners, there's a whole part of the book that talks about the Russian reaction to Hersey and Hiroshima. And in a nutshell, they hated Hersey, they hated Hiroshima. They regarded it as a propagandistic threat to them. And my whole entree into that was, again, through another scrap of a document that nobody else had paid attention to in the New Yorker archive, showing how the Russians had actually dispatched their own Pravda reporter to Japan to do counterfactual reporting to debunk what Hersey had found. And so they essentially, this reporter went in and said, but to Nagasaki, to differentiate it a little bit, he said, you know, oh, well, actually, you know, I was there. Hersey's report's a lie. You know, I spoke with survivors who just jumped in ditches, you know, and came out unscathed. There's no such thing as radiation poisoning. Hersey is a propagandistic spy. So that research was pretty crazy. I had a Russian translator and researcher who I worked really closely with, and it just went so much deeper than we thought that it would. And that was, again, you know, incredibly exciting. And, you know, I don't usually, you know, double guess a lot of my findings, but I do try to vet stuff with experts. So for instance, when we found out about the Grove submission, I was talking with Leslie Grove's biographers about how to parse what his reasoning would be in terms of actually greenlighting the piece. With the Soviet narrative, I mean, I remember calling, you know, Russian scholars and, you know, scholars who deal with Stalin in the bomb and Soviet reaction to the bomb, and they were like, where did you find this? You know, it just like had not, and again, these were just scraps of documents. I mean, literally the Soviet thing was a clipping in the you know, that I found, and it's just, for me, it's like pure nerd joy.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. And then there's, you know, yeah, no, it's just, I mean, it doesn't get better than that. Again, in my sad little world, but, you know, and then the other really, you know, evocative part of the research, honestly, was being on the ground in Japan. You know, I was in Tokyo and Hiroshima researching and interviewing there, and Hiroshima is a totally rebuilt city. It has 3 million people living there now. You know, obviously there's very little to suggest what it had been like before the bombing, because it was totally decimated. But even though it's, you know, this totally modern metropolis, it's the most haunted place I've ever been in my entire life. And I mean, I just felt like I was living outside my skin the entire time that I was there. But I did, you know, get to interview the governor there. I interviewed blast survivors, and I did also spend quite a bit of time and toured Hiroshima with Hersey's last surviving major protagonist in the book.
And how was that?
It was intense.
I mean, to be physically with somebody who was at an atomic bomb detonation, that can't be a normal day. It was the least normal day of my life. And I wrote a story about, for National Geographic about it, that came out right when my book was released. But the person I was with was called Koko Tanamoto, and she was an infant when the bomb went off. And Hersey documented
family's ordeal. She had been in her mother's arms, not far away from the detonation point, in their house, and the house collapsed on top of them. The mother somehow survived. The baby survived. They managed to scratch their way out through the debris and escape their neighborhood just before a wall of fire swept through it. So Coco, who was 74 or 75, when I was in Hiroshima about a year and a half ago, and we toured what's left of old Hiroshima together, and she also showed me the exact point of the detonation. And look, Hiroshima has a world-class museum. It has a lot of it has UNESCO World Heritage Site. It has a lot of incredible memorials, but the actual site of the detonation, which I never would have found without her, it's like on a side street. It has a tiny little standing marker. It's in front of a 7-Eleven. So that was that was like a pee pants moment where you're like, I can't believe that this is happening. This is so surreal.
It's so surreal. It's so surreal. And by the way, I just want to mention to folks that, like, for those who haven't read it, you can go read Hiroshima, like the piece that John Hersey wrote. I think the New Yorker just has it for free on its website. You can also buy a book. And the surreality of it, I mean, it's just, above all, it is horrific what he writes about, but I mean, the surreality and kind of the way that he makes it personal. I mean, there's details of that story, like the way somebody's skin slips off like a glove, or like these little children vomiting, like in the immediate aftermath. I mean, these like certain details that are just almost impossible to forget, but just totally necessary. I mean, there was a great quote, I think it was by William Shawn, something like this kind, or maybe it was just somebody else who read the article in the aftermath right away, who said, this kind of thing cannot happen on the earth without all humans knowing about it. Like something to that effect. And anyway, all right. So I just want to skip to something else. I want to like just dig in for a second on the politics of this, because it is very interesting. There's both the politics of how this piece was received, and then there's the politics of how your book has been received. And I want to just dig into that for a second. So on how this was originally received, I mean, here you are a moment ago saying that the Soviets wanted to debunk this article, and I'm guessing what their motivation is, because it made it look like the United States had this incredibly new, devastating weapon that the Russians did not have. And so the Russians were sort of jealous and trying to discredit the United States and make them look not so powerful. So in that sense, and I know others in the military felt this way too, as you report in your book, it was sort of a positive story for the United States, because it was like, don't mess with the United States. But then of course there is like the far more broad story, which is this kind of sense of moral horror that like the United States has felt like only Hitler has committed an atrocity, but now it looks like the picture is a little bit more murky. So anyway, and then I think you have gone through, and I want to give you the platform to talk about it in a moment, but you have gone through a similar kind of thing with the release of this book, in the sense that like, is this book pro-America or anti-America, or is it just neither or both? So what do you think?
Okay, well, three things. First of all, on the note of, the Soviet reaction, look, the Soviets covered up Hiroshima from their citizens. Like, I mean, we basically had the two emerging superpowers in the Cold War engaging in a cover-up of Hiroshima for totally different reasons. The U.S. partly because they don't want to be seen as having outdone Hitler in atrocities, and the Soviets because, they're now at a mega disadvantage to the U.S. because the U.S. has the nuclear monopoly, and the Soviets know that they're years away from having the bomb themselves. Leslie Groves estimated that they would get it in 5 to 20 years. Guess what? It's 4. They have it in 1949. And so I think, look, at first the U.S. again is very invested in covering up, what their then experimental mega weapons have done to a largely civilian population. I mean, it's estimated now that around 90% of Hiroshima's population, or those killed, were civilian, even though the target did have some small military value. But the eventually. For them to see a story like Hiroshima, which exposes the U.S. totally, it not only exposes, the truth about nuclear weapons and what it's really like to be on the receiving end of nuclear warfare, it's also exposing how much the U.S. covered up, from its citizens about the bombs that were created and detonated in their names. So for the U.S. government to go from from a point of cover up and suppression of information to saying, well, actually, we're going to find some kind of utility in reporting like Hersey's. I mean, it shows how much the US's policy evolved over a year, and how tricky what a tricky walk on the tightrope it always was for them. How much to reveal about the bomb to their advantage, and how much to cover up about it. And they were kind of back and forthing on that. Was Hersey's book pro-American or anti-American? Hersey's book was it was pro-humanity, and for Hersey, he had seen absolutely the worst in human nature during the war. He'd seen everything from combat to concentration camps. But when he gets to Hiroshima and he sees what can be done with one primitive bomb, that's it. He realized that nobody around the world really had any sense that we had arrived at this moment where we were in the position to eviscerate human civilization. And for him, he felt now that we were in the atomic age, the only chance that human civilization had to survive was if they really understood what it meant to live in the atomic age, what these bombs really were, and why leadership had to be held to, why the powerful had to be held to account, especially given that the US was not going to have the nuclear policy indefinitely. So again, I would say that this was his attempt not to promote his own nation's shame nor its prowess, but to ensure that his children had a life in front of them.
Absolutely. And I mean, if he doesn't report that story, I mean, if he doesn't go there, this story maybe never gets told, or it's certainly not told with this vividness. I mean, the time to write that story, it seemed to be receding. Anyways, I mean, thank God he got there and told the story. But let's pivot to you and your book. I understand everything you're saying about it being pro-humanity, of course, but inevitably, stories like this, which reflect on the character of this nation, are going to become hot potatoes or whatever and get battered around in a political way to serve whatever kind of side of the argument you want to take. And you've now gotten drawn into this a little bit. I mean, I'm just kind of, what has the response been from readers to this book?
I would say, look, it's been largely positive in the sense that they see this book as a celebration of Hersey's purpose, which is exactly what this book is. But I mean, let's face facts also, Fallout is also a reminder of unheeded warnings. And, this is what happens when, this is what humans are capable of when they dehumanize other humans. This is what nuclear warfare really looks like. So when you have a president who threatens to, eviscerate Afghanistan on a whim, or, lob a nuke into a hurricane to allegedly defuse it, these are the ramifications. So it is, political in that sense. I think one of the things that's been very interesting is how, and demoralizing, frankly, is how predictable the response has been, depending on which publication or which media organization is covering it. We got 6 placements in the New York Times. The Times couldn't have been more supportive. It was an editor's pick. They called it magisterial. We were on the New York Times podcast. We were, teased on the front page, on the homepage, on not just on August 6th, but for a week after the podcast came out. Because the reviewers, plural, for the for that publication, they did see it as a humanist message, in the way. Again, is forwarding, Hersey's original message. However, I'm a book reviewer and a contributor also to the Wall Street Journal. And so I ran an op-ed there, what I thought was actually a pretty innocuous op-ed. And it was about how Hersey, as a journalist, had given future journalists a tool to tell other catastrophe stories and to get how to put a human face to mass casualty statistics. That's literally all the story was about. Immediately, the response from that crowd was, I mean, I didn't read through all the comments, but the sampling that I sampled, was, what it was very politicized, and it turned entirely into a referendum on, we should have dropped the bomb, and, the Japanese got what they deserved. And I mean, it was almost like they were targeting it at me, but what they didn't realize is that their quarrel was actually with Hersey, not with me. But it's just been I just, again, the predictability of it, it's like, you know, the cliche of the mutual reactions has just been really interesting to experience.
Yeah, it just seems that filter just comes across anything. You don't even, nobody knows how to interpret reality without first putting a political filter on it. Look, I have a couple more questions,
Which
but
is, by the way, the
sorry.
opposite of what Hersey's trying to achieve, right?
Right.
I mean, literally, the entire work is about seeing the, you know, seeing the humanity in your enemy. You know, in this case, it's, you know, how on earth is Red America ever going to humanize Blue America and vice versa again? I mean, like, just the fact that a work like this could not penetrate, you know, on that level, and even for, you know, even get people, you know, on the red side at least to bat an eye was extraordinary.
There was just on that note, and I think, like, as I was saying earlier in the conversation, like, I mean, this story was sort of there, but nobody could put quite this angle on it. And the angle he put on it was the human angle, and just individualizing it through these 6 people. And there was this great quote also that occurred in your book. Somebody saying, like, when they read that article, they replaced all the Japanese names with American names. And then they let that sink in. And, like, this could be us. And that is just sort of, in a nutshell, the effectiveness of that piece, the humanity of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, the whole point was, you know, for Hersey was always to get American readers to be able to empathize with you know, the Japanese victims. And I mean, this was a really dicey proposition because, you know, most American readers hated their Japanese, you know, defeated enemies. And but, you know, what the end result was is, for many people who read it and read Hersey's work in 1946, if they read it with a sense of regret or wistfulness or horror, a lot of people weren't, like, you know, regretful over what the bombs had done to the Japanese. They were thinking about themselves, you know, and because everybody knew that the time of the Americans' nuclear monopoly was going to be over. And then the same thing could happen to Dayton, Ohio, to Akron, to Houston, to New York, to San Francisco. You know, I mean, you really could swap in all the names. But the fact is that even that kind of selfish empathy was helpful to Hersey, you know, because it really helped drive home the reality of again, the atomic age, and changed how people felt about the bombings and felt about nuclear weapons and nuclear attacks as tenable parts of our military strategy and arsenal. So he was able to harness even the most selfish sorts of empathy.
Yeah. Okay, I have just a few more questions of my own, but we're almost out of time here, and so I wanted, like, we do have a question from the audience that I wanted to ask. Anne wants to know how your book, how Japanese people from Japan or even Japanese Americans feel about a American woman writing about this issue. Has that come up ever?
I would say, I mean, look, the support that I have had has been from my Japanese sources has been total.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just complete access, complete respect. I'm sure, you know, I really can't overstate how much help I got from the Japanese, including, you know, from the governor of Hiroshima to Japanese journalists to, you know, my fixers there, my researchers there. It's unclear, you know, an interesting topic for me when I was writing the book was how the Japanese felt about the fact that Hersey was telling their story for the first time to the world. And you mean the Japanese were not allowed to talk about or publish anything about Hiroshima until after the occupation because they were under a press code. So, I mean, in a way, they had to rely on this American reporter to tell their story. I mean, the Japanese certainly didn't need Hersey to tell them about what it had been like to be on the receiving end of warfare, but he ended up being at least the initial spokesman, and it remains to this day the widely acknowledged spokesman for what nuclear warfare looks like. I will say that when the book was when Hersey's Hiroshima was eventually released in Japan, it was an instant bestseller.
All right, so I want to ask one more audience question and then we'll wrap. But I have one other question of my own too. But just the question, quite simply, is where is this scoop today? You know, I mean, and I'll add my own thought on top of that. That, like, you know, with smartphones everywhere, you know, there's a lot of kind of like direct on the ground reporting that is sort of effectively done by social media globally. But do you see a kind of frontier or another story hiding in plain sight this person wants to know that that could be such a story?
COVID.
Mm.
Yeah, COVID in America. I mean, COVID I mean, look at how much our government is attempting to cover up and downplay a global existential threat. I mean, it's a little familiar, right? And I mean, it's when we think about how Hersey's story and the story of, the truth about nuclear aftermath and nuclear attack it seemed like it was in plain sight, but it really took, one person to go in and really investigate the hell out of it. I mean, there's so much reporting that is going to have to be done on, the reality of what has unfolded in this country and across the globe over the last 9 or 10 months. It's the mega story of our generation.
Yeah. Sorry, one other question from the audience. What's next for you? Are you working on a new story about a handsome man who's very glamorous and writes a seminal piece of literature?
Yeah, his name is Mark Cecil.
Hey! I give you full access.
Excellent. Please, God, let my next topic be a woman. I wish. Seriously, it has to be on a woman. I don't know. I don't know what it's going to be yet. I don't know what the next book is. It usually takes me kind of a year to figure out what I want to do. I know that I want to do something about fanaticism and how normal people get converted to fanaticism, and whether that's going to be within an American context or a German context, historical, I don't know. But I'm sort of feeling my way into that topic now. And right now I'm in the middle of negotiating dramatization terms for Fallout, for scripted and documentary. And so I will be having a hand in those also to make sure that they have the tenor that they should.
By the way, I totally got that feeling. I mean, with the Hemingway book, it's hard because there's been so much that's been done with that time period. But I could completely see the movie of this, and not just a documentary, certainly that, but I could see like a real kind of Hollywood treatment of this kind of story. It's got all the elements. All right, we have to wrap, but I want to ask one last question, which is that I asked this of all the writers that I usually have on one of my shows. And mostly I interview fiction folks. And so this question makes a little bit more sense for them, but when I think about it, actually, it's just as good for nonfiction. So say you're having an ideal reaction to this book, and your ideal reader is reading this book, and everything that you dreamed that you'd ever get across to a reader is getting across to this reader. And that reader closes this book. Just tell me about the feeling that you want that reader to be left with.
Motivation. Especially in this election year, I don't know how we could be more motivated and galvanized right now than we are, but motivated on several fronts, again, to be involved in some way. I don't even want to say in a movement, but committed to helping us find our way back to a point of humanizing each other, and also to really being motivated to make sure that the nuclear landscape is paid attention to in campaigns and in our elections, and that our leaders are having sane and responsible nuclear policies. I know that's a lot to ask. We're facing other existential threats in real time right now, but it just seems to me like it's folly to put our heads in the sand about these things. And so again, pure motivation, I hope.
And can I just add something to that? I watched another interview of yours about Hemingway, and you said one of the things that drew you most to that topic was the sense of grand ambition that Hemingway had. And I think the way you phrased it is meaningful accomplishment. Is that the phrase maybe that you used? But there was something about doing something big and meaningful with your life. And this sort of is related to, I think, this motivation that you're talking about. Maybe not the exact same thing, but I just wanted to close with, could you just give me an idea? I wanted to hear that from you again, because that idea really struck me. And you had followed it up by saying, maybe people today don't feel that as much, this desire for some grand accomplishment.
I mean, I don't remember the exact context in which I said that, but meaningful accomplishment definitely is a catchphrase for me. So it sounds like, it probably was me, but I mean, for Hemingway, it was just, look, he wasn't just purely in a pursuit of celebrity, although that was a big part of it. He did want to be very famous for his accomplishments, but the bottom line is he wanted the accomplishments, and they had to be big, they had to be literary, they had to be, deeply consequential, they had to be profoundly intelligent, but they also had to be, accessible to the whole of humanity, and the fact that pursuit of celebrity was so deeply rooted in the pursuit of accomplishment made him less reprehensible to me, and I think one of the things that made, when you look at so much of pursuit of celebrity today and how totally empty and vacuous it is, and how many people are so exceptionally famous but have no record of any conceivable accomplishment at all, it just seems more valuable to me, and more just admirable, and for Hersey, John Hersey, it was he didn't even care about the accomplishment, he just wanted the message to get across. I mean, it's no small coincidence that he achieves his magnum opus, releases his magnum opus, and then basically disappears from public view. So for him, there was zero element of celebrity. Meaningful accomplishment, it was an understatement, but he still ended up retreating into a very private life.
Yeah. Well, anyway, it did leave me with that very feeling. It's funny, when I ask authors this, I don't always feel the same way as what the author wants me to feel, but I did feel what you just said. I felt that feeling of motivation, that feeling of like, if you're a journalist out there or a writer of any kind, you can make a difference. It's possible to create something that will change the world. And I just loved the way you closed the book with this kind of exhortation to journalists to keep going and keep fighting the good fight.
Well, that I should have said that right away. So thank you for saying that, because that's actually hugely important to me also. I mean, we must realize the deadly importance of our journalists, and find ways to support them. Because I think even if people, intellectually know that the free press is really important, they don't know that they have a role in supporting them. So you must, subscribe to your local paper, speak out when your president is being despicable to, a female member of our White House corps and calling them shameful. We have to support our press corps. I did hope that this book would be extremely galvanizing on that front also. So God knows if we go into a Trump second term, we're going to need our investigative journalists more than ever.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. All right. Well, Lesley, thank you so much for staying on a little bit extra. This has been fascinating. Can you hold up the book one more time so people can see it? Wow. Beautiful. The amazing Lesley Blume. Thank you so much for joining us on A Mighty Blaze. Folks, this has been Frontliner Friday. Please like, subscribe, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, everything. We're here bringing you amazing, amazing authors like Lesley every single week. So we'll see you again next week. Thank you, Lesley.
Thank you so much.
All right.